So I'll just start with the title because it's important that you understand what this is pertaining to, just because of what I go into talking about later. So my project is about if female serial killers should be treated differently from their male counterparts, an argument in opposition of the difference in applications of the law. So let's start by talking about a few female serial killers. I focus primarily on these four as case studies for my literature review. So the first one we have up there is Belle Gunness. She was a Norwegian immigrant who moved to the United States when she was an adult. She lived in the Chicago area for a while and was married for the first time while she lived there. Her and her husband burned down their bakery to get insurance money, which is probably where her string of crimes started. At this time, she also helped a family friend take care of her child, and the child ended up dying in her care. At the time, people thought it was just an infant who was sick. There were very high infant mortality rates at the time because this was in the 1860s. So it wasn't uncommon for children to die at such a young age, plus her mother was gravely ill as well. So they just were like, oh, it's not your fault. You were just taking care of this kid and it died. She later moved to a small town outside of Chicago where she purchased a farm with the money she had after her husband also died in another fire for insurance money. Are we seeing a pattern? But anyway, so she would put ads in a Norwegian-speaking newspaper in the area advertising that she was a wealthy widow wanting a husband. So she would contact these men, get them to drain their savings accounts into cash and come visit her, and then they would all mysteriously disappear and their families would never hear from them again. They maybe received a letter from her saying, oh, he went to California, he left me, stuff like that, but the family members could not track anyone down. Her last victim is how she actually got caught. His brother decided to look into why his brother wasn't writing to him, because he would write to him frequently, and all of a sudden they just stopped. All the savings was gone, so his brother came around and they found the farm up in flames with bodies in the basement and in a well and everywhere. They're still finding bodies on that property to this day. The next one I focused on was Leonarda Canculi. She lived in Italy during the Second World War. I think which World War it was. She lived in Italy at the beginning of the Second World War. She had a son that was in the age to be drafted, and she also had profound mental issues. She, in her head, believed that if she murdered a certain person and turned it into soap and cakes, that if her son ate it, he would be protected and wouldn't get hurt. So her thought process was she was trying to be good, but she ended up murdering 3 different women. The first one she murdered with an axe in her living room. She murdered all of them with the axe, but the first one was the most brutal because she hadn't planned on it, she just decided to do it. And through the several different people, she figured out the best method to turn their fat into soap, and then she would dry their blood and mix it into tea cakes and serve them to people who came to her home and sold the soap to people. And they would consume and use these products unknowingly using human remains. She would dispose of her bodies using caustic soda, which is extremely alkaline, I think. It basically just breaks down the body into a big puddle of goo, and then she would pour it into a septic tank so that you couldn't find remains. She was caught because her son caught her disposing of some of the remains and found the blood and stuff like that. Dorothea Puentes was a lady who lived in LA in the 80s. I know there's a little bit of a jump from the 40s to the 80s, but weirdly enough, there's not a ton of female serial killers. Dorothea she looks like she's about 80 in this photo. She's actually 50, if I remember correctly. She ran a boarding house that she would get tenants who had intellectual disabilities, other disabilities, alcohol and substance problems, other things like that. Basically anyone who's collecting government welfare, and she would give them a place in her home and then she would either poison them or smother them and continue to cash their checks for them. She did actually have charges before she started doing this that prohibited her from doing that, but due to lack of law enforcement at the time, they were not able to catch her until one social worker just happened to really care about someone and chose to keep close tabs on him. She was sentenced to life in prison and died in prison in 2012. And then lastly, Cyanide Malika, that's not her actual name. I cannot pronounce her actual name, and I can't find anywhere that actually has her whole first name on it. But she is India's first convicted female serial killer. She would go to temples, find women who were vulnerable and trying to pray to the gods to give them help, and she would give them poison tea and then steal all the valuables off of their bodies. She was arrested in 2007 and convicted in 2012. So here are some case studies. I will say the case studies I am using to demonstrate my point are not female serial killers or male serial killers. That is simply due to there's not enough female and male serial killers that do the exact same crimes or have similar counts against them to demonstrate the studies, but these are still convicted or going through the process of being convicted murderers who are both male and female. So we'll start with a case from here in Nebraska, the case of Sydney Loof. She went missing in November 2017, and her body was later discovered dismembered along a gravel road outside of Edgar, Nebraska. She was 24 at the time. She got lured into going on a date with Bailey Boswell, who was up there using the alias Audrey, and after going on the date with her and Audrey Trial, dismembered Sydney Loof and scattered her remains. To this day, they still haven't found part of one of her upper arms, but the rest of her body was discovered along with other pieces of evidence that were there. Boswell was sentenced to life in prison. The panel of 3 judges that overlooked her case to see if she could get capital punishment decided her actions did not meet the standard for extreme depravity that would be needed for the death penalty, but Aubrey Trail did receive the death penalty. He also tried to appeal his conviction, and it was denied on the grounds that he caused a huge scene during his trial and basically screamed that Bailey Boswell was innocent and then used a razor blade he snuck into court to slice his own throat. Both faced the exact same charges of first-degree murder and improper disposal of the human remains, but their outcomes were extremely different. Trail was rejected a retrial because he felt it was unfair, while Boswell was granted a change of venue, a different judge, and then no death penalty, basically. The next case is the Watts family murders. These happened in 2018 in Frederick, Colorado. Chris Watts killed his 2 daughters and his pregnant wife. He is sentenced to life in prison. The only reason he did not receive the death penalty is because his wife's family asked for the death penalty to be removed from the table so that there was no more deaths involved in this situation. He is currently serving 5 life sentences, 2 concurring and 3 like one right after the other, plus another 36 years for the improper disposal of human remains and 48 years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy. All of the counts up here show exactly what he was charged with. The reason there are 5 counts of murder is because they could double the counts of murder for each child since they were under the age of 12, and he was in a position of trust with them. And the last case that I used as a case study on here is the case of Lindsay Clancy. This case is actively still going through the court system. It happened in 2022. Basically, Lindsay strangled her children with an exercise band. Her children were 5 years old, 3 years old, and 7 months old. She had been prescribed 13 different psychiatric drugs before the murders and had postpartum mental health problems. After murdering her own children, she jumped from a 2nd-story window, claiming that she was hearing a voice telling her to jump and kill her children, very similar to the case of Andrea Yates. While this case is still ongoing, she is facing 2 counts of juvenile murder and 3 counts of assault and battery with a deadly weapon. But yeah. So the case studies looking at each other, generally the men in these case studies would probably have received the death penalty, and there were more people vying for the death penalty than the women. Generally, women are thought to be much more nurturing, caring, gentle. There was a study done in the 90s that said women were actually incapable of being serial killers, which has since been disproven with all that. But their different penalties really demonstrates that, as Chris Watts only didn't get the death penalty because it was taken off the table. Aubrey Trial was given the death penalty and his appeal was rejected, while Bailey Boswell only got life in prison, and Lindsay Clancy will most likely get life in prison. So another important fact to look at when you're looking at the difference between male and female serial killers is their MOs, which means modus operandi, which is basically the way they carry out their crimes. So females are generally more in a caregiver position. That's why most female killers you hear about are nurses, child caregivers, in-home caregivers for elderly patients, mothers. They also generally use less violent means of murder. They use poison a lot, or like nurses use bubbles in an IV line, which will kill you. One great example of women using poison is the rise of aqua tofana, which is a specific poison that was made by women for women to use against their abusive husbands. You would go talk to this woman, she would give you a prescription for this, or she would give you perfume, and then you would put it in your husband's food, drink, whatever, and it would kill him almost instantly. The woman who created aqua tofana actually got arrested and charged with, I believe, over 500 counts of murder. The reason it's not talked about more is there's not a lot of good sources that talk about it, just because it did happen so long ago, and it's generally greatly, it's like fantasized about. A lot of books talk about it in almost a fantasy-like sense. But female killers also generally get less harsh convictions. A lot of times they'll get sent to either life in prison, or they'll be sent to mental institutional, like prison type things, because people generally believe if women are killing, it is because they have something wrong with their brain, not because they're violent. Male killers, however, generally go for a more wider range of victims. You hear a lot about, there's been the killer doctor, there's been random men who just pick people up like Ted Bundy, there's Jeffrey Dahmer, stuff like that, where it's just a much wider array of victims, and it's not so much just a certain set of people. Their crimes generally also tend to be more violent. There's a lot more stabbing, cutting, blunt force trauma, all that fun stuff. And then finally, they usually receive harsher sentences. Most people, if you hear of a man who has committed a violent crime, there's a lot of cry for the death penalty or the harshest sentence possible, because people believe that if it's a man, they are violent, they will do it again, they will hurt people, all that stuff. And finally, so these are the conclusions that I got from doing this project, which basically is the difference in between the sentencing should not be as vast as it is. A lot of people, I don't think, realize just how large of a gap it is between the sentences for female and male killers or serial killers. Again, most women don't get that bad of a punishment. A lot of them can get plea deals for a lot smaller sentences. Secondly, women in the past have been considered incapable of committing these crimes, and this is a dangerous bias that is still in play today. This is due to the fact that for generations, women were told to be the ones who took care of the kids, took care of the house, were just didn't really do anything. All that fun stuff, which basically just makes it so when a woman does kill, they always ask, well, I'm sure she had a reason, or I'm sure that something's wrong that made her do this, and it's not just a she killed. And finally, all crimes have consequences, and those consequences should be applied equally regardless of gender, race, religious affiliation, or other differences. Basically, just because a woman kills should not change the outcome she gets. I know if a lot of these crimes, if I would have sat down and asked you when I talked about the female serial killers, who you thought did those crimes, I'm almost certain all of you would have told me a man did them. So the sentencing disparity is just, again, a huge impact on not only our criminal justice system, but the lives of the victims, of the families that they have, and all that fun stuff. And here are my sources.